Hello, I'm Derek Lon, and welcome to SAMPRO TV Global. Today we are going to be sharing a recent interview we conducted with a leading intellectual and the greatest linguist of all time. Born in 1928 and still advocating for social change at the age of 94, today we are speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky to get his thoughts on the war in Ukraine and the changing power of US diplomacy in the world. Let's see what he has to say.
Start as things now stand, both sides are escalating. The United States has provided advanced tanks. It's pressured Germany to provide German tanks, Leopard tanks. It's planning. There is talk of F-16 aircraft going to Ukraine. Ukraine wants them. They're talking about it. It'll probably do it. Then come further steps towards escalating the war. Meanwhile, Ukraine is being devastated. The longer the war continues, the worse it'll be for Ukraine. The claim is we have to keep supporting Ukraine because it'll be in a better negotiating position. It's very unlikely. What's happening is Ukraine is losing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It's interesting that what the United States expected at first was that Russia would fight the kind of war that the United States carries out. When the United States carries out a war, say the invasion of Iraq, goes straight for the jugular, destroy everything right away, shock and awe, destroy transportation, communications, energy, anything that makes the country function. The Russians didn't do that. Life in Kiev is not pleasant, but it's going on normally. That wasn't true in Baghdad. It wasn't even true in Belgrade, not when the US goes to war. But now Russia is beginning to carry out US style wartime activities. It's going after infrastructure, not in Western Ukraine, but in parts of Ukraine. Longer it continues, the more that'll go on. It'll escalate. Ukrainian economy has suffered very severely. It's not clear how much more it can take. So continue the war and escalate it. There's more and more destruction in Ukraine and effects around the world. Millions of people are facing starvation because of the partial closing off of the exports of grain and fertilizer from the Black Sea region. It's a major exporter. It's not cut totally, but it's curtailed. There is the constant and increasing threat of escalation to nuclear war. Probably the worst thing that's happened, which is not much talked about, is that the war has reversed, not just stopped, but reversed the small steps that were being taken to deal with the environmental crisis. Now it's reversed. New oil fields opening. The fossil fuel companies are delighted. They're making immense profits. They're planning to produce more fossil fuels for the next 30 or 40 years. That means we're done. We're finished. Human life is not going to survive that. We don't have much time to deal with the environmental crisis. We've wasted a lot of time. It's getting worse and worse. It's coming to the point where we may be reaching irreversible tipping points. And meanwhile, the fossil fuel companies are planning, with US government assistance, I should say, planning to expand fossil fuel production because of the new opportunities that are offered. This is, from the point of view of history, this is just unspeakable. Here we are racing to a precipice. We don't have much time. We know what can be done, must be done. We're doing the opposite. Started with with Bill Clinton. George Bush, President first Bush, had made unequivocal, unambiguous promises to Mikhail Gorbachev that if Gorbachev agreed to the unification of Germany within NATO, which is quite a concession considering the history, but if he agreed to that, Bush promised that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, meaning 1 inch to the east of Germany. Go as far as East Germany, no further. There's been a lot of deception about this, but the documents are present, available. You can read them at the National Security Archive, original documents on the internet. Unequivocal, unambiguous. Clinton tore it up, started a new Cold War. He did it, as he explained to his friend Boris Yeltsin. He did it for domestic political reasons, to try to gain the Polish vote, the vote of ethnic communities from Eastern Europe. He was a domestic politician. And he told Yeltsin, well, I'm sorry, but I have to do this. He started it. The second Bush pushed it much further. He went as far as inviting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. He was blocked by France and Germany at the time, and he was opposed by virtually the whole US diplomatic corps. Even hawks like his own defense secretary, Robert Gates, said this is reckless. It's going to cause a reaction. The current CIA director, who was US ambassador to Russia, strongly opposed. But he went ahead. And after the uprising in 2014, the United States moved to essentially integrate Ukraine within the NATO military command. And that was, again, highly provocative. After the uprising, which overthrew the government coup, basically in 2014, the United States moved to essentially integrate Ukraine more or less within the NATO US military command, military maneuvers, interoperability of weapons, actually pretty much what the US is doing to Taiwan right now. It's very similar. It's highly provocative. And the Russians kept objecting. They said, well, we can accept the NATO moves to our borders in other countries, but not Ukraine. Ukraine is, if you take a look at a map and you look at history, it's obvious why. Heavy weapons facing Russia and Ukraine, say German tanks now, that awakens memories. There's an open plane straight to Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's happened a couple of times before in the last century. No Russian leader is going to tolerate this. Every American specialist understands that. And Biden actually increased it. He moved to offer Ukraine what he called an enhanced program for NATO membership. Right through the State Department conceded publicly that they would not take any Russian security concerns into consideration. It sort of set the stage for invasion. Again, that does not justify invasion. The invasion was, there were alternatives. If you look at the record, Emmanuel Macron, France, was who's about the one serious statesman in the world these days. He was making extensive efforts to try to convince Putin not to carry out the invasion. We have the transcripts of their discussion. They were published in France, and they're available on the internet. until a couple of days before the invasion, Macron was offering reasonable alternatives that would have met major Russian objectives. But Putin just disregarded it. In fact, with contempt. At the end, he said, I have to go ice skating. I don't have time to talk to you. And a couple of days later, invaded. It's also extremely stupid from Russia's point of view. The effect of the invasion, quite apart from what it's doing to Ukraine, if you take a look at the broader context, it's just a tremendous gift to the United States, enormous gift. That's one reason why the United States isn't even talking about negotiations. They're gaining from it. In fact, the official US policy is that the war has to continue to weaken Russia. And as many commentators have pointed out, the US is really getting a bargain for a fraction, small fraction of the US military budget. It's causing severe harm to its only military adversary in the world. That's a bargain. And beyond that, geopolitically, Putin has solved a problem that has persisted through the entire Cold War. You go back through the entire Cold War, back to the Second World War, there was a major question as to whether Europe would move on an independent path, become what was called a third force in international affairs, as it certainly could. It's a wealthy, advanced society, more advanced in many ways than the United States, could be, except militarily, could be an independent force. Charles de Gaulle called for an independent Europe. Willy Brandt, Germany moved for what was called Ostpolitik, moving toward the east. Europe is basically a German-based industrial system, and its natural trading partner is Russia. Russia is rich in resources that Europe doesn't have. Europe has advanced technology and industry, which Russia doesn't have. It's sometimes called a marriage made in heaven. It's a perfect relationship. And the whole German-based industrial system in Europe was based on it. Became a major issue when the Soviet Union collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev called for what he called a common European home, extending from Lisbon, the Atlantic, to Vladivostok. No military alliances, moving towards moderate social democracy. No victors, no defeated. He's driven Europe into Washington's pocket. The United States is delighted, of course. Now, the NATO-based system, which is run by the United States, incorporates Europe. It's a gift from Putin. In fact, the United States is so delighted by it that, as I'm sure you know, in the latest NATO summit, the US basically expanded the North Atlantic to include the seas off Korea. The Indo-Pacific region is now part of the North Atlantic, if you hadn't noticed. This is the US allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, were invited to the NATO summit for the first time. So now the United States can mobilize, it hopes, even the Pacific for its conflict with China, which it's building up. It's almost at war with China now, trying to, US policies are mostly negative, have to stop things, doesn't have positive policies. So you have to stop Chinese development, which is going to very much harm South Korea. Samsung, for example, which is a major industry, chip industry, it's now under orders from the United States not to pursue the China market, which is its major market. Same with the Netherlands and Europe. Same with Japan. I don't know how long US allies are going to tolerate this. But this is all part of the system that Putin handed to the United States on a silver platter, quite apart from what's happening in Ukraine. So, and US corporations are just making an enormous profit out of this. Fossil fuel companies, military industry, they're just booming. It's a bonanza for the United States on every respect. There's a whole industry that's telling us what they think is in Putin's mind based on nothing. It's kind of like reading tea leaves. We know what the Russians have said. It's pretty definite, pretty clear. They want Ukraine to be neutralized, to have a status rather like Mexico, which Mexico can't join a Chinese-run military alliance, obviously, or like Austria during the Second World War, during the Cold War. They want to be neutralized and demilitarized, which presumably means no heavy weapons aimed at Russia, right on Russia's border at the highly critical point. That's their official, and also some form of independence or autonomy, some degree, for the Donbass region, the mostly Russian-oriented region, and Crimea, taken Crimea, which is pretty much part of Russia for almost all its for centuries, and is strong and has Russia's only warm water military bases, sea bases in Crimea and Sevastopol. So that's very important for Russia. So that's basically their war aims, as they state them. I mean, people have concocted all sorts of stories about Peter the Great planning to conquer Europe and various fantasies. It's kind of like the claims that China wants to conquer the world, build up wild stories about the adversary. That's old, goes way back. But as far as we understand, as far as any evidence is concerned, Russia's aims were neutralization of Ukraine, demilitarization, preservation of the rights of the Russian-oriented regions in Donbass. The details have changed over the years. Up until the invasion, Russia was supporting the Minsk agreements, which would have meant autonomy for Donbass within a federated Ukraine, something like Switzerland or Belgium, a federation. Now it goes beyond. They say they want Donbass to be incorporated in Russia, even some other regions along the sea which connect Crimea to Russia. If you look at the map, Putin has now called for them to be annexed into Russia. So predictably, as the war continues, both sides harden their policies. That's normal. Whether there's still options for negotiation and diplomacy, we really don't know. You can't know unless you try. If you refuse to try, of course, there's none. So we know that as late as last March, there were negotiations, serious negotiations. That's well documented from Ukrainian and US sources under Turkish auspices. The Prime Minister of Britain, then Boris Johnson, flew to Kiev and informed the Ukrainians that the US and Britain didn't want negotiations. He was followed by US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. We don't know the details, but he presumably gave his usual message, the one I mentioned, that the war has to continue to weaken Russia. Anyhow, the negotiations broke down. There's very little. The press doesn't cover this. The government's opposed to it, so the press ignores it. So we don't have a lot of information. But we know at least that much. Are there possibilities now? Could be. I mean, people who are interested in diplomacy have put forth ideas. You take a look at the current issue of Le Monde Diplomatique, for example. There's an article by two Finnish specialists in diplomacy, and they propose some steps that could be taken to lead to low-level accommodations, which could then expand into larger possibilities. Whether this is feasible or not, there's only one way to find out. Try. If you refuse to try, of course not. And in fact, if you look at the discourse in the United States, all about war, nothing about negotiations, diplomacy, virtually nothing. If you look at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, he's called for diplomacy. If you look at and in fact, the Pentagon is the dovish element in the American government. They're the ones who are trying to hold back the escalation. They understand what war is. You go to people in Congress, they say, they're so irresponsible, it's almost unbelievable. They say, well, maybe there'll be nuclear weapons, but who cares? They don't understand what a nuclear war is. It's amazing. The Pentagon understands. They don't want escalation. It's a definite possibility. So far, it's easy to imagine steps that could lead to nuclear war. So, for example, the United States, just a couple of days ago, in fact, announced that the guiding of precision weapons has been by U.S. Military, which means they're directly, that when these advanced missile systems attack Russian forces, they're directed by Americans. The equipment, of course, is coming from the United States and its allies. So far, Russia hasn't responded, but they might. They might attack supply lines, for example. They haven't done that, even inside Ukraine. They might go on to attack supply lines in Poland. They might use more advanced weapons. As soon as you start with that, the chances for moving up the escalation ladder increase. And anyone who's ever studied war games or thought about these things knows that once you start with one foot on that ladder, it's easy to go up. One provocation leads to another, and so on. Pretty soon you're gone. And it seems that a lot of Congress and many commentators don't comprehend that there cannot be a nuclear war between major powers. We're all finished if that happens. The military analysts understand this very well. Take a look at the doomsday clock, famous doomsday clock. They just moved it to 90 seconds to midnight. They gave up on minutes during the Trump years. Now it's seconds, 90 seconds to termination of the species. It's not a joke. Well, what's happened as an effect of the Ukraine war and other developments in the world is that the United States is the major oil producer. But apart from the United States, the main fossil fuel production is in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They're beginning to move away from the United States for the first time. Saudi Arabia has been almost a colony of the United States since its origins in the 1930s. Now it's moving more independently. It's making arrangements with Russia, with China, even some with Iran, which is its major enemy, but it's moving toward the east. United Arab Emirates is already deeply embedded in the Chinese system. If you look at the Chinese expansion through Asia, the so-called Silk Roads, the maritime Silk Road goes right through the United Arab Emirates. In fact, that's one of the bases for it. entry into the Red Sea and off towards Europe. And this is beginning to undermine reliance on the dollar. These countries, including all the BRICS countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, are setting up their own arrangements for trade and commerce independent of the US-based dollar economy. They don't like the US sanctions are opposed by almost the entire world. Even Europe is opposed to the sanctions. It harms them. They go along because they're subordinate to the US. But if you look around the world, almost nobody obeys the US sanctions. They don't believe in them. They don't agree with them. They're setting up their own arrangements, trade in some of it's Chinese currency based, some of it's other arrangements, but the world is just drifting away from the US dollar based economy. And the petrodollar is declining because as Saudi Arabia sees its future in arrangements with the East, with China, Russia, Iran, it's drifting away from US domination. And it's worth noticing that the United States has almost no positive policies, only negative policies. We have to stop others. That's US policy. Conflict with China, we don't have any. US has no programs. It has to stop Chinese programs. That's US policy. So we have to cut back China's technological development. We have to carry out, the official term is encircle China with a ring of sentinel states, including South Korea, Japan, Guam, Okinawa, Australia, armed with precision weapons, advanced precision weapons aimed at China. Meanwhile, major naval maneuvers, RIMPAC, so-called, in the Pacific, aimed at China, but crucially prevent China's technological development. The business press by now just calls that a war against China, try to prevent China from getting advanced semiconductors, chips, and so on. That's where South Korea fits in. Because that means cutting back on Korean economic development as well. Germany is the one that's suffering the most, but it's also true for South Korea and Japan. Cutting off the China market would be very harmful to them. They're trying to find ways around it somehow. But the point is, going back, a lot of this is based on the threat that the United States poses with sanctions. And as long as the international financial system is located in New York and Washington, the threat of sanctions is very severe. You can be cut out of the international financial system. And that's for such the SWIFT system, so-called. And so other countries are just finding a way around this. It was quite striking that the newly elected president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, was just in Washington a couple of days ago. And the big controversy he had was over arms to Ukraine. Said Brazil's not going to send arms to Ukraine. What that means is Brazil is joining almost the entire world. India isn't sending arms to Ukraine. Indonesia isn't. They don't want this. They see this as a proxy war between the United States and Russia, fought with Ukrainian bodies. They don't want to have part of it. So Lula called for, he said, Brazil will move towards a negotiated, will try to be an intermediary to bring about a negotiated settlement, but we don't want to be part of the war. And that's the position of almost the entire world outside of the United States, Britain, and the Anglosphere, Europe, Australia. It's not just me, incidentally. This is a common analysis. If you take a look just yesterday, Graham Fuller, whose career was in the CIA. He was one of the top intelligence officers in the United States for decades. It just came out with a discussion of current policy, basically like this. He said things have so deteriorated in the United States, we have no positive policies any longer. Just try to stop other things. I mean, the extent to which this is true is astonishing. So the United States, internally, the United States is decaying in many ways. The bridges are collapsing, the subways don't work, things are falling apart, needs infrastructure. Well, Congress wouldn't pass it. The Republicans are opposed. They finally agreed, but it had to be called a China competition bill. So if we want to build bridges in the United States, it has to be in the framework of competition with China. It's part of the, we can go back to the reasons, but it's part of the neoliberal programs that go back to Reagan, which are designed specifically to concentrate wealth in a very small number of hands and to let the rest of the society collapse. That's basically neoliberalism. And it's worked in a way. Just to give you an estimate, the Rand Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental corporation, very respectable, did a study on the transfer of wealth since Reagan, the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population to the top 1%, $50 trillion. That's not small. And it goes along with decline in benefits, decline in job security, large number, probably majority of the workforce just gets by from one paycheck to the next. The United States does not have the social services that exist elsewhere in the world. So there's no health security. Even simple things like maternity care for women after childbirth. Every country has it, not the United States. It's the only country that doesn't, outside of a couple of Pacific islands. The United States is the only major country, maybe the only country, in which mortality is actually increasing. That never happens, except in war, pestilence. But mortality is actually increasing among the white working class people in their working years, 25 to 60. It's just a collapse of the society. I mean, you see it in other things like the killings in the schools, and these are symptoms of a society that's collapsing from within. And the one strength that it has is military. So that's your strength, that's what you use. It's not competing with China in developing Eurasia through the Belt and Road system. There's no program like that. Just against, we try to stop other things. It's a significant change in the last years. It's connected with internal changes. So there's been a shift in the United States from being an industrial power to being a financial power since the 1980s, basically. Production has stagnated or declined, and finance has just boomed. And finance doesn't produce anything; it just plays with money. You take a look at the biggest corporation in the world, Apple, $1 trillion corporation. When Steve Jobs, who founded it, was running it, it was aimed at developing good products. That's what he wanted. He's out. Current CEO, Tom Cook, what he wants is to devote resources to financial manipulations. You can make more profit that way. So you don't make better computers, you just play games on the market. Much more profitable. But it means it's one of the symptoms of the society declining. You can't have a functioning society based on people playing games on the stock market. That's the production is somewhere else. And all of that is happening at the same time. The United States is far and away the world dominant power, even economically. But so US-based multinationals control about half the world's wealth. That's nothing even close to that. And of course, in the military dimension, the United States is completely in a sphere of its own. But apart from that, it's an internally collapsing country. It's not going to be a success in the long run. If you look at this in broad geopolitical terms, you look at modern history, mostly Europe-based. Europe pretty much conquered the world, so it was centered in Europe. England was the dominant military and economic power, and British policy was to try to prevent continental Europe from being unified. So the great fear of British policymakers were that one country, maybe France in the 18th century, Germany later, one country would take over and unify Europe. British constantly tried to prevent that. It was an island off the coast of Europe. Well, that was pre-World War II. After World War II, that changed. The United States replaced Britain as the global power. Now, the Western Hemisphere, which is run by the United States, is an island off the coast of Eurasia. It's a kind of an expansion of the more local policy of Britain, Europe, when Britain was dominating the world. Well, we know where that led to. Now we have a greater version of that with the United States trying to run the world as an island off the coast of Eurasia. It's not going to work. That means holding on to Western Europe at one end, trying to hold on to Japan and South Korea at the other end. But they have their own interests and concerns. In fact, Japan is still working closely with Russia in oil development in Siberia and so on. The United States doesn't like that, but can't stop it. It's all of these things are happening in the world. The point is, we do not have much time to waste. All of these powers must come together and accommodate to work on global problems which have to be solved or they'll all be destroyed. If we don't work together on the climate crisis, we're all finished. Either China, Russia, and the United States cooperate, or they all are destroyed. There's no borders to these problems. Climate crisis has no borders. The nuclear war just destroys everything. Pandemics, this one's bad enough, but other ones are coming, and they could be much worse. We've been lucky so far. If you take a look at the viruses that have spread, there's some, like Ebola, which are very lethal, but not very contagious. There's some like COVID, which is very contagious, like Omicron, very contagious, but not very lethal. I mean, it's killing a lot of people, but not terribly lethal. Suppose one comes along that's both contagious and lethal. Could happen. Could be happening right now with avian flu. The virologists don't know. There are likely to be others. They could be much more serious. It's criminal that resources are not being poured into this. I mean, scientists have some idea about how to prevent it. It could be universal vaccines. It's not inconceivable. Very little research. No government money going into it. The money is going into destruction. If somebody's watching this from outer space, they think we're insane. He's a harsh, brutal autocrat he's a kleptomaniac. He's gotten to be super rich himself and his clique around him. I don't want to have dinner with him. He's not my friend. But he's not Peter the Great. He's not trying to conquer the world. They've got narrow interests, which can be accommodated, I think. Can't know unless you try. But there should be ways to bring about an accommodation, a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic settlement in the Ukraine conflict that'll keep it from escalating, destroying Ukraine with all the side damage it's causing, and to move towards allowing the integration of Europe, Western Europe, and the rest of Eurasia into something like what Gorbachev depicted, a common European home with no military alliances and expansion of the natural commercial trade relations between resource-rich Russia, technology, industrial-rich Western Germany. They need each other, and it should be possible to reconstruct that. I should say that the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, almost certainly by the US, was another step towards breaking this relation. In fact, an act of war, if you look at it. But it's interesting. It's not discussed in the United States. You can't talk about it. But it's not a joke. It's another step towards breaking what should be a natural relationship. The idea of NATO expanding over the entire world to the Indo-Pacific region, that should be intolerable. South Korea should not go along with this, nor should Japan. One possibility, a narrow possibility, is a move back towards the regulated economy of the early post-war years. I don't think that was wonderful by any means, but it was the fastest growth period in Western economic history. For the United States, it's called the Golden Decade. In France, in Europe, it's the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. That was a form of basically pretty much regulated capitalism. Finance was under control. There were no great financial crises. In the United States, the Treasury Department kept a firm hand on finance. Take a look at the statistics. It's shocking. I mean, in the United States, until through the 50s and the 60s, the great growth period, wages, real wages, tracked productivity. Take a look at the chart. Breaks in the late 70s. Productivity goes up, real wages stagnate and decline. It's the same on just about every other measure. Health costs were pretty much normal for Western countries till the late 70s. Start going up. Health outcomes go down. Just about every measure breaks. As I said, the estimate of transfer of resources is about $50 trillion. It's not even the top 1%. Most of it goes to a fraction of the top 1%. It's just about every measure you look, that's what you see. Neoliberalism, the rhetoric says free markets. That's a pure lie. It's not free markets. Take a look at the World Trade Organization. It's highly protectionist, has protectionist measures that go way beyond anything in the past. That's why Pfizer and Moderna just announced that they're going to raise the prices of vaccines. It costs them about $3 to produce a vaccine. They're going to charge $130. How can they do that? Because of protectionism, because of radical opposition to free trade on the part of Clinton and everyone else who set up this rules-based economy. It's take deregulation. As soon as deregulation started, crises started. But there's a little footnote to that. It's not deregulation. It's deregulation plus bailout. That's neoliberalism. Deregulate, make a ton of money, crisis, we bail you out. That's case after case each time. Go through the details if we had time. It's a fraud. It's no free market. It's a powerful state intervening to protect the rich and the corporate sector with great success. As they say, $50 trillion is not a joke. It's happened similarly in other countries. Most of the workforce is living precarious lives. Real wages are barely moved. For male non-supervisory workers, it's about what it was in 1979. Been plenty of economic growth, only in very few pockets. So is there an alternative to that? Well, a narrow alternative is what preceded, but you can go way beyond that. Why shouldn't working people take control of production, for example? They can, certainly can. In fact, they have tried to do so. But then you move towards economic democracy. That's also a possibility. And there are many options ahead. If we break the straitjacket of thinking things have to be this way, they don't by any means. I'm very deeply embedded in the popular movements in the United States. That's my interest. I don't care about the elite media. They don't care about me. I don't care about them. So I'm perfectly happy to talk to them if they want to, but it's not antagonism. We just live in different worlds.
That certainly was interesting. What are your thoughts? You might not agree with everything Professor Chomsky had to say, but we hope that it helped broaden your perspective just a little bit. Going forward, SAMPRO TV Global has a lot of interesting interviews planned, and we look forward to sharing new and unique perspectives with you. For SAMPRO TV, I'm Derek Lon, and thanks for watching.